keyword intro reveal Plumbat. On the 17th of November 1968, a small German-registered freighter named the Scheersburg had cast off from a commercial pier on the Scheldt in the port of Antwerp and turned her bow west toward the open sea. In her hold were 200 drums, painted black, stenciled with the chemical mark for lead, and listed on the manifest under a single Latin word, Plumbat. The drums did not contain lead. They contained 200 tons of uranium oxide, milled, refined, and packed for industrial use, what the trade calls yellowcake, enough fissile feedstock fed into the right reactor to produce material for between 30 and 40 nuclear weapons. The shipment had been bought, on paper, by a small chemical company in Milan. It had been cleared, on paper, by the European Atomic Energy Community in Brussels. It had been loaded, in plain daylight, off a Belgian dock. 16 days later, the Scheersburg A surfaced again in the eastern Mediterranean, anchored off the Turkish coast at Iskenderun. Her holds were empty. Her crew had been replaced. Her logbook had a gap of 9 days that none of her papers could explain. For 10 years, no European agency would acknowledge that the cargo was missing. When the truth was finally written down in a quiet Belgian Senate inquiry in 1978, it carried a code name that no one in Brussels had been authorized to use. The code name was Plumbat, lower, third, the Euratom System. When the European Atomic Energy Community was founded in 1957, its central purpose was civilian. It existed to coordinate the peaceful use of nuclear materials inside what was then the six-nation common market. To do that, Euratom built an accounting system. Every kilogram of uranium that entered the community had to be declared. Every transfer between member states had to be logged. Every export beyond the community required a certified end user. The system was, by the standards of the late 1960s, advanced. It was also entirely paper-based. Inspectors checked invoices, manifests, and customs stamps. They did not, as a matter of routine, physically follow a shipment from one port to another. They trusted the bill of lading. The Israeli government, by the middle of the 1960s, had a problem that Euratom's paperwork was not designed to anticipate. At a site in the Negev desert called Dimona, French and Israeli engineers had built a reactor whose civilian description bore very little relation to its actual purpose. By the autumn of 1968, Dimona was operational, but its supply of natural uranium, the feedstock it required to produce plutonium, had been cut off. France, under President de Gaulle, had stopped exporting. The United States, under President Johnson, was refusing to sell. South Africa, the obvious alternative, was still years from being a reliable partner. Israel needed 200 tons of yellowcake. It could not buy them openly, and it could not afford to be seen looking. Freeze, lower, third, the buyer. The cover company was registered in Milan and was called, depending on which document you read, Asmara Chemie, or, in some files, Asmara Chemicals, a small West German chemical firm with a registered subsidiary in Italy. Its director, a businessman named Herbert Schulzen, was a former Luftwaffe pilot turned dye-stuff merchant. According to documents released by the Belgian Senate inquiry in 1978, Asmara approached the Belgian state mining company Société Générale des Minerais in the spring of 1968. It proposed to buy 200 tons of uranium oxide. The stated purpose was the manufacture of a petrochemical catalyst at a plant near Genoa. The application was unusual. The quantity was unusual. The catalyst process described in the paperwork was, on inspection by later investigators, chemically unworkable. None of this stopped the purchase. Euratom reviewed the file. The buyer was a registered community company. The seller was a registered community company. The destination was a registered community country. Under the treaty, no export license was required, because no export was taking place. The uranium was, in legal terms, simply moving inside the common market. Euratom issued the clearance in October. The contract was signed in November. On the 17th, the drums were loaded onto the Scheersburg A in Antwerp. The ship's owner, on paper, was a Liberian shell company. Her master, a man named Burrick, had been hired 6 weeks earlier and was not informed of the cargo's content. Her flag of convenience meant that no European inspectorate had jurisdiction once she left port. The paperwork was, by every legal test that existed in 1968, in order, lower third, the transfer. The Scheersburg's stated route was Antwerp to Genoa. The voyage in normal weather takes a coastal freighter between 8 and 10 days. She did not arrive in Genoa, according to her own subsequent logbook entries and the reconstruction performed by Norwegian investigators a decade later. The Scheersburg A altered course in the western Mediterranean, somewhere south of Sardinia. Between the 21st and the 29th of November, she was met at sea by a second vessel, an Israeli-registered freighter whose name was never officially established and whose presence in the area was never officially logged. The drums were transferred at sea. The operation, according to later Israeli sources speaking to the historian Elaine Davenport and the journalists Paul Eddy and Peter Gilman, was conducted by personnel of the Israeli intelligence service, the Mossad, working in cooperation with a small detachment of the Israeli Navy. The receiving ship sailed east toward the port of Haifa. The Scheersburg A, lightened by 200 tons, continued east as well, but on a different bearing, toward the Turkish coast, where a quiet anchorage at the port of Iskenderun would allow her crew to be paid off, her registry quietly transferred, and her hold cleaned before any European authority thought to ask where the uranium had gone. She reached Iskenderun on the 2nd of December. Her papers indicated a successful delivery to Genoa. No one in Genoa had ever heard of the consignment. Lower third, the cover holes. Euratom did not notice that 200 tons of uranium oxide had left the community. The buyer filed quarterly stockholding reports for the catalyst plant near Genoa. The plant did not exist. The reports were accepted. The first internal flags appeared in 1969, when a routine inventory reconciliation by the Belgian seller produced a quantity that did not match the Italian buyer's stated holdings. The matter was referred to Euratom. Euratom referred it to the Italian authorities. The Italian authorities referred it to the company. A confidential Euratom memorandum dated October 1969 acknowledged that the uranium could not be physically located. The memorandum was not circulated outside the Commission. No public statement was made. No member state government was formally notified. It is not entirely clear, even now, who knew what and when. According to declassified West German files released in 2007, the West German Federal Intelligence Service, the BND, had been informed by an unnamed liaison partner, almost certainly the CIA, by 1972. The CIA, according to records cited in a 1978 Time magazine investigation, had concluded by the early 1970s that Israel was the destination, but had recommended against public disclosure. The matter rested there for 10 years. The Scheersburg A continued to trade in the Mediterranean under 3 different names and 2 further flags. Asmara Shami was wound up in 1970. Herbert Schulzen was never charged. In 1977, an Israeli scientist named Mordecai Vanunu, working at Dimona, began to take photographs of his workplace. He would not publish them for another 9 years, but his evidence, when it appeared in the Sunday Times in 1986, confirmed what the Belgian inquiry had already quietly suggested. The yellowcake had gone to Dimona. The Dimona reactor had produced plutonium. The plutonium had been used to assemble an undeclared nuclear arsenal, whose size, in Vanunu's account, ran to between 100 and 200 warheads. The lower third. The system did not look. The Plumbat operation succeeded for a reason that the Belgian senators of 1978 set out in their final report with notable precision. Euratom safeguards were not designed to detect a diversion. They were designed to detect a discrepancy in the paperwork. As long as the paperwork balanced, the system saw no diversion, even when 200 tons of nuclear feedstock crossed an entire sea. The International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, had been in existence since 1957. But the IAEA had no inspection authority inside the common market that was reserved by treaty to Euratom, and Euratom had no inspectors at sea. But none of the safeguards regime in 1968 contemplated the possibility that a registered community company might be a front. After Plumbat, the rules changed. The IAEA assumed parallel oversight of Euratom material in 1973. End-user verification for civilian uranium transfers became mandatory in 1978. Physical accompaniment of high-grade shipments by national authorities became standard in the 1980s. But the change came 10 years too late, and only after Israel had what it had set out to acquire. Lower third, the modern ECHO. The International Safeguard System in 2025 is more sophisticated than anything Euratom imagined in 1968. It uses satellite monitoring, environmental sampling, sealed cameras, and increasingly blockchain-anchored chain of custody records. It still relies, at the foundation, on declarations made by the states being inspected. In February of 2025, the IAEA reported that Iran's stockpile of uranium, enriched to 60%, had reached 275 kilograms, enough, with further enrichment, for several weapons. The stockpile had grown by 60 kilograms in 3 months. The IAEA, citing Iranian non-cooperation, was unable to verify the locations of all of it. In the same month, the United States, the United Kingdom, and Australia finalized the AUKUS arrangement under which Australia will receive nuclear-propelled submarines whose reactors run on weapons-grade uranium. The transfers will take place under a treaty exemption that, by design, falls outside ordinary IAEA inspection. The Plumbat lesson, written into the safeguards literature in the 1970s, was that paper accounting does not stop a determined state. Physical accompaniment does. Independent verification does. Treaty exemptions do not. The Belgian senators noted in the final paragraph of their inquiry that the most dangerous component of the entire operation had not been the ship, or the cover company, or the drums on the dock. The most dangerous component had been the assumption, on the part of every European inspector who handled the file, that the paperwork would have caught anything important. The Cold War is remembered as a contest of superpowers. 200 tons of yellowcake in November of 1968 demonstrated that a small stake with patience, a shell company, and a freighter under a flag of convenience could rewrite a regional balance of power without firing a shot. The drums on the dock at Antwerp were marked Plumbat. The word means lead container. It is also, in the Latin original, the word for a weight dropped quietly to the bottom of the sea. 10 years passed before anyone in Brussels was willing to write the code name down. Word count. 1,